the collective breath of 300 apex predators caught in their throats. The silence in the grand ballroom was so absolute, so suffocating, that the clinking of ice in a discarded whiskey glass sounded like a gunshot. The Alpha King's 4-year-old heir, a boy who had not allowed a single soul to touch him since his mother's brutal murder, had just buried his fists into the frayed cotton of a lowly Omega's sleeve. Elite guards surged forward, their eyes bleeding into a lethal, glowing gold. Death was seconds away. But the Omega didn't drop to her knees. She didn't bare her neck in terror. Instead, she looked down at the trembling cub, offered a soft, radiant smile, and gently pulled back. Clara Hastings was practically invisible, and for an Omega in the Silver Creek pack, invisibility was the greatest survival tool one could possess. She wasn't beaten or starved the modern werewolf world liked to pretend it had evolved past the barbaric practices of the Dark Ages, but she was entirely dismissed. In a society built on dominance, fangs, and the raw power of one's inner wolf, an Omega was a relic. She was viewed as a biological anomaly, wired to soothe and nurture rather than hunt and conquer. Clara worked in the pack's archives and assisted in the medical ward. At 24, she lived a quiet, solitary life on the edges of the pack's territory in a small, damp cabin surrounded by Oregon pines. Her days were spent filing lineage records, grinding herbs, and avoiding the gaze of the higher-ranking wolves who strutted through the pack house. But today, the pack house was a hive of frantic, terrified energy. Clara, the silver polish, Evelyn, the head healer and reluctant head of domestic affairs for the week, snapped as she rushed past. And make sure the scent maskers are burning in the east wing. If the king catches even a whiff of rogue blood from the holding cells, Alpha Silas will have our heads. Dominic Sterling was coming, the Alpha King of the Obsidian Ridge territory. He wasn't just a myth, he was a walking natural disaster. Dominic had united the warring packs of the Pacific Northwest not through diplomacy, but through sheer, terrifying dominance. He was a billionaire in the human world, commanding a massive logistics empire, but in the shadows of the forest, he was an executioner. 3 years ago, his mate Victoria had been assassinated in a coordinated rogue ambush. Dominic had slaughtered the perpetrators, leaving a trail of blood that stained the neighboring territories for months. He had survived, and so had his son, Leo. But the king had returned from that massacre completely changed. He was cold, ruthless, and emotionally hollowed out. And now, he was arriving at Silver Creek to negotiate a border treaty and, rumor had it, to formally announce his intention to take a new mate. The prime candidate was Serena Whitmore, a high-ranking alpha female from the formidable Bloodwood pack. Serena was striking, politically ruthless, and had been positioning herself at Dominic's side for the better part of a year. Clara hurriedly wiped down the antique silver candelabras in the main hall. She could feel the shift in the atmospheric pressure before she heard the cars. The heavy, suffocating aura of a supreme alpha rolled over the estate like a thundercloud. It made Clara's knees ache, and her inner wolf whimper, pressing itself flat against the edges of her mind. Through the grand windows, a fleet of black, armored SUVs crunched onto the gravel driveway. The doors opened, and out stepped the king's elite guard, massive men and women radiating lethal intent. Then, Serena emerged, wrapped in a designer trench coat, her sharp features set in a triumphant smirk as she surveyed the Silver Creek pack members who had lined up to submit. Finally, Dominic stepped out. Clara's breath hitched. Even from a distance, the sheer scale of the man was overwhelming. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and moved with a terrifying grace. His eyes, a piercing, icy gray, swept over the subservient crowd with absolute indifference. But what caught Clara's attention wasn't the king. It was the small boy trailing behind him, clutching the hand of a stressed-looking nanny. Leo. The cub was pale, his dark hair falling over eyes that looked far too old and far too empty for a 4-year-old. He moved stiffly, flinching every time a guard stepped too close or a car door slammed. Clara's Omega instincts, usually buried deep beneath years of suppression, flared violently to life. A deep, agonizing pull tugged at her chest. The boy was drowning in a sea of aggressive, territorial pheromones, and no one was noticing. Serena stepped up to Dominic, looping her arm through his. Dominic didn't look at her, but he didn't shake her off either. As the royal entourage moved toward the grand doors, Clara quickly gathered her cleaning supplies and ducked into the servants' corridor, her heart hammering against her ribs. She had to stay out of the way. If she drew the attention of the king, or worse, Serena Whitmore, her quiet life would be destroyed. By nightfall, the Silver Creek pack house had been transformed into a suffocating arena of political theater. The grand ballroom was dripping in opulence, but underneath the scent of roasted meats, expensive champagne, and blooming orchids, the air was thick with tension and the bitter copper tang of fear. Because they were severely understaffed, Clara had been drafted to carry trays of drinks to the outer edges of the room. She was wearing a simple, high-necked black dress that marked her as pack staff. She kept her eyes glued to the polished mahogany floor, navigating the room by the polished shoes and glittering heels of the elite. At the head table, Alpha King Dominic sat like a statue carved from obsidian. He barely touched his food, his icy gaze tracking the movements of the alphas in the room. Serena sat to his right, wearing a stunning crimson gown that left little to the imagination. She laughed loudly at a joke made by Alpha Silas of Silver Creek, her hand frequently resting on Dominic's forearm, staking her claim for all to see. But Clara's eyes kept darting to the far side of the head table. Leo was seated in a massive ornate chair that swallowed him whole. His plate was untouched. He was violently rocking back and forth, a self-soothing motion that no one seemed to care about. The nanny had been dismissed to the kitchens by Serena, who had declared that the king's heir needed to learn how to sit with the adults. Clara watched, her chest tightening. A young alpha from a visiting pack, emboldened by too much whiskey, laughed uproariously, slamming his fist on the table near the boy. Leo flinched so hard he nearly tipped out of his chair. He clapped his hands over his ears, his breathing turning shallow and rapid. He's having a panic attack, Clara realized, her inner wolf pacing frantically. The noise, the smells, it's too much for him. She looked at Dominic. The king was locked in a tense, low-voiced conversation with his beta, Jasper, completely unaware of his son's distress. Serena noticed, though. Clara saw the alpha female shoot the child a look of pure, unadulterated disgust before turning back to her champagne. Clara gripped her silver tray so hard her knuckles turned white. "It's not my place," she repeated her lifelong mantra. "Stay invisible. Stay safe." Suddenly the music swelled, a heavy, booming waltz that vibrated through the floorboards. It was the breaking point. Leo scrambled out of his chair. He didn't cry out, he hadn't spoken a single word since the day his mother died, but his face was a mask of pure terror. He ducked under the heavy velvet tablecloth and bolted. "The prince!" someone shouted. Chaos erupted. The casual elegance of the ballroom shattered as the king's guards instantly shifted into combat mode, their hands dropping to the silver-laced blades at their belts. Dominic was on his feet in a microsecond, a terrifying guttural snarl ripping from his chest. The sound forced half the room to their knees in pure biological submission. "Lock the doors!" Jasper roared over the panic. Clara froze near a towering pillar wrapped in white roses. The crowd was surging, alphas and betas confused and agitated by the king's sudden fury. Dominic was tearing through the crowd, his eyes glowing a solid, terrifying gold. He was searching for his cub, ready to slaughter anyone who had dared to threaten him. Serena was shrieking something about incompetent security, adding to the deafening noise. Clara backed away, trying to press herself into the shadows of the pillar. But as she moved, a small, trembling weight slammed into her legs. She looked down. Leo was curled against her shins, his tiny hands clutching the fabric of her cheap black dress like a lifeline. He was trembling so violently that Clara could feel it in her own bones. He looked up at her, his wide, terrified eyes begging for a sanctuary that didn't exist in this room of monsters. Clara's breath completely stopped. The Omega within her, the part of her soul designed by the moon goddess to protect, to soothe, to heal, shattered its cage. The suffocating fear of the Alpha King vanished, replaced by an overwhelming, fierce need to protect the child. She didn't have time to react before the crowd parted like the Red Sea. Dominic Sterling stood 10 feet away. The air around him was visibly rippling with power. His fangs had descended, and his claws tore through the fabric of his tailored suit jacket. He looked like a god of war, and his glowing eyes were locked dead onto Clara. "Step away from my son," Dominic commanded. The voice didn't sound human. It was the Alpha command, a psychic weight meant to crush the willpower of anyone in its path. Around Clara, grown men whimpered and pressed their faces to the floor. Serena pushed her way to the front, pointing a manicured finger at Clara. "You stupid little Omega. Let go of him before the king rips your throat out." But Clara couldn't step away. Even if she wanted to, Leo had clamped his fists onto her sleeve, burying his face in her skirt. He was letting out high-pitched, silent gasps, completely overwhelmed. If Clara moved, If she ripped her skirt away to submit, the boy would be left exposed and terrified in the center of the room. The guards raised their weapons, aiming at Clara. They didn't know if she was a threat, a rogue in disguise, or an assassin. All they saw was a stranger holding the royal heir. Dominic took a slow, lethal step forward. "I will not ask again." Panic spread through the ballroom like wildfire. "Clara's Pack Alpha," Silas yelled from the sidelines. "Kill her! She's just a broken Omega, my king! Do what you must!" Clara looked at Silas, then at Serena's gleeful face, and finally, into the glowing, murderous eyes of the Alpha King. She felt the heavy, crushing weight of his aura pressing down on her shoulders, demanding she drop to her knees and bare her neck for execution. Instead, Clara took a deep breath. She let go of her serving tray. It hit the floor with a loud, ringing crash that made everyone flinch. Slowly, deliberately, ignoring the weapons pointed at her heart, she sank gracefully to the floor, kneeling not in submission to the king, but to get on eye level with the terrified cub. She didn't cower. She didn't cry. Clara smiled. It was a warm, radiant, completely fearless smile. "It's a little loud in here, isn't it, sweetheart?" Clara murmured. Her voice wasn't loud, but in the dead silence of the room, it carried like a bell. Leo peered up at her through his messy bangs, still clutching her sleeve with a death grip. Clara didn't pry his fingers away. Instead, she gently placed her warm hand over his icy, trembling knuckles. She pushed a wave of her Omega scent forward, not the scent of submission or fear, but of crushed lavender, warm rain, and profound, unyielding safety. It was a targeted release, meant only for the boy. Leo gasped. The violent trembling slowly began to subside. Dominic froze. The lethal forward momentum of the king halted entirely. The gold in his eyes flickered, fighting with the icy gray of his human consciousness. His chest heaved as he inhaled sharply. He smelled it. Beneath the stale champagne, the heavy colognes, and the sweat of fear in the room, he caught the faintest trace of something he hadn't felt in 3 years. Absolute peace. "It's okay," Clara whispered to the boy, completely ignoring the most dangerous man in the world standing mere feet away. "You're safe. I've got you." Gently, smoothly, Clara pulled back from Leo's grip, but she didn't push him away. As she pulled her arm back, she opened her arms completely, offering him a choice. The entire room held its breath. The prince hated touch. He fought his nannies, he shied away from the guards, and he barely let his own father hold him. Leo stared at Clara for a heartbeat. Then, he lunged forward, throwing his small arms around Clara's neck and burying his face into her shoulder. He clung to her like she was the only solid thing in a crumbling world. Clara wrapped her arms around him, pulling him close, resting her cheek against his hair. She rocked him gently, humming a low, ancient Pack lullaby under her breath. A collective gasp echoed through the room. Serena's jaw dropped, her face turning an ugly shade of red. "What is this trickery? Pull that filthy Omega off of him," she shrieked, stepping forward to grab Clara. "Touch her," a voice rumbled, so dark and steeped in violence that it cracked the marble floorboards, "and I will separate your head from your spine." Serena froze, the color draining from her face. Dominic wasn't looking at Serena. He wasn't looking at Alpha Silas. His eyes, now completely human but wide with an unrecognizable emotion, were fixed on Clara. He stared at the way his traumatized, unreachable son melted into the embrace of this nameless woman. Then, in the silence, a small, raspy voice echoed from Clara's shoulder. A voice no one had heard in 3 agonizing years. "Mama." The word dropped like a bomb. Clara's eyes widened, and she looked up, meeting the Alpha King's gaze. For the first time, Dominic Sterling didn't look like a conqueror or an executioner. He looked utterly, devastatingly shattered. And as he took a step toward her, the bond, ancient, immediate, and impossible, snapped into place between them, vibrating with a force that knocked the breath completely out of Clara's lungs. She wasn't just an invisible Omega anymore. She was his. The word hung in the stifling air of the ballroom, a solitary drop of water in a desolate wasteland. "Mama." For 3 years, the finest pediatricians at Johns Hopkins, the most expensive child psychologists in Manhattan, and the most powerful shaman healers of the Northern Covens had tried to pull a single syllable from Leo Sterling's lips. They had all failed. Yet here, kneeling on the scuffed hardwood floor in a cheap, uniform dress, a nameless Omega had unraveled the boy's trauma with nothing but a smile and the scent of crushed lavender. but it was the invisible tether pulling at Clara's soul that terrified her more than the boy's sudden speech. The mate bond. It didn't just snap into place. It crashed into her like a freight train. The scent of him rich cedarwood, petrichor, and the sharp, undeniable spice of absolute power flooded her senses, wiping away the suffocating stench of the panicked ballroom. Clara's inner wolf, a creature that had spent its entire existence cowering in the dark, suddenly stood up, howling with a ferocious, possessive joy. Dominic's breathing turned ragged. The terrifying Alpha King, a man who had ruthlessly decimated entire financial sectors in Wall Street and slaughtered rogue armies without blinking, fell to his knees. The heavy thud of his knees hitting the floor sent a fresh wave of shock through the spectating crowd. He didn't look at his son. His icy gray eyes, wide and completely stripped of their usual glacial walls, were locked onto Clara's face. He reached out, his hand trembling slightly, a massive hand adorned with a platinum Patek Philippe watch that probably cost more than the entire Silver Creek pack house. He stopped an inch from her cheek, his knuckles white, as if afraid she was a mirage that would shatter if he made contact. "Dominic, what are you doing?" Serena's voice shattered the fragile bubble around them. She stalked forward, the heels of her custom Christian Louboutin shoes clicking furiously against the floor. "She's manipulating him. It's a trick. Some filthy Omega pheromone trick. Guards, seize her!" Two of the Bloodwood pack guards stepped forward, emboldened by their alpha female's command. They didn't make it a second step. Dominic didn't stand. He didn't even look away from Clara. A low, vibrating snarl simply rolled from the depths of his chest. It wasn't loud, but the sheer, concussive force of his alpha aura blasted outward like a shockwave. The two Bloodwood guards dropped like stones, gasping for air as the psychic pressure crushed their lungs. The crystal chandeliers above them violently rattled, raining a fine dusting of glass onto the banquet tables. "Jasper," Dominic spoke. His voice was a gravelly whisper, yet it commanded the room completely. The King's Beta, a towering man with a scarred jawline, materialized instantly, stepping between Serena and the kneeling trio. "Not another word, Alpha Serena," Jasper warned, his hand resting casually on the hilt of a silver-forged hunting knife, "or I will consider it an act of war against the crown." Serena's jaw snapped shut, her face mottling with indignant rage, but she took a smart step back. Dominic finally closed the agonizing inch between them. His fingertips brushed Clara's cheek. The contact sent a jolt of pure electricity straight down Clara's spine, making her gasp. The touch was agonizingly gentle, entirely at odds with the violent monster the world believed him to be. "Mine," Dominic whispered, the word tearing out of him like a confession. His thumb stroked her cheekbone, wiping away a smudge of silver polish she hadn't realized was there. "My wolf, he's been screaming for you." Clara couldn't breathe. I'm an Omega," she stammered, the ingrained hierarchy of her life fighting the overwhelming pull of the bond. "I'm nobody. You're the king. You are everything," Dominic corrected, his voice hardening with absolute certainty. He looked down at Leo, who was still buried in Clara's neck, his small hands gripping her black collar. "And you saved my son." Alpha Silas of Silver Creek, sweating profusely and realizing the political ground was shifting violently beneath his feet, took a hesitant step forward. "My king, Dominic, we had no idea. Clara is just a record keeper. If we had known she was your destined mate, we would have." Dominic stood up, his towering frame casting a long shadow over Silas. The gentle, reverent man who had just touched Clara's cheek vanished, replaced instantly by the ruthless warlord of Obsidian Ridge. "You kept my queen cleaning your silver?" Dominic's voice dropped 10 degrees. The air in the room grew dangerously thin. Silas paled, choking on his own saliva. "No, I mean, it's a temporary rotation, my king, she." "Save it," Dominic cut him off, his eyes flashing a lethal gold. "The border treaty is void. The Bloodwood alliance is dissolved. Pack your bags, Silas. When I return to this territory, I won't be coming to negotiate." He turned his back on the sputtering Alpha and looked down at Clara. He didn't order her to stand. Instead, he reached down, slipping one massive arm beneath her knees and the other around her back, lifting both her and the clinging cub effortlessly into his chest. Clara gasped, instinctively wrapping her free arm around Dominic's broad shoulders to steady herself. The smell of him up close was intoxicating. She was pressed against the crisp, expensive fabric of his Tom Ford suit, feeling the heavy, steady thud of his heart. "Clear the path," Jasper barked into his earpiece. "Where are we going?" Clara whispered, her heart hammering against her ribs as Dominic carried her through the parted sea of dumbfounded, terrified werewolves. Dominic looked down at her, his jaw set, his eyes burning with a possessive fire that left no room for argument. Home. The convoy of armored black Cadillac Escalades tore through the winding mountain roads of the Pacific Northwest, leaving the boundaries of Silver Creek far behind. Outside, a violent rainstorm had begun to batter the tinted windows, but inside the spacious cabin of the lead SUV, the silence was thick and charged. Clara sat in the plush leather seat, feeling entirely out of her depth. She was still wearing her cheap, high-necked uniform, a stark contrast to the luxurious, bulletproof interior of the king's personal vehicle. Leo was fast asleep, his head resting heavily in her lap, his small fingers still loosely curled into the fabric of her skirt. He looked peaceful, the chronic lines of stress around his mouth finally smoothed away. Across from her sat Dominic. He hadn't stopped looking at her since they left the pack house. He had discarded his suit jacket and unbuttoned the collar of his dress shirt, revealing a sliver of heavily tattooed skin and the edge of a jagged, silver-inflicted scar that ran over his collarbone. He looked exhausted, lethal, and utterly captivated. "He hasn't slept outside of a locked, soundproofed room in 3 years," Dominic said quietly, breaking the silence. His eyes tracked the gentle rise and fall of his son's chest. "And even then, he wakes up screaming." Clara gently brushed a lock of dark hair from Leo's forehead. Her Omega instincts purred, a warm, healing energy flowing naturally from her fingertips into the boy. "He was drowning in there," she said softly, finding a courage she didn't know she possessed. "The noise, the smells, the aggression. He's incredibly sensitive to emotional frequencies. He needs quiet. He needs safety." Dominic's jaw tightened. "I tried to give him that. I built a fortress for him, but I couldn't heal him. My wolf is too aggressive, too stained with blood. I only made him retreat further inside himself." He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, bringing his face closer to hers. The space between them crackled. "But you brought him back in 10 seconds. Dominic's eyes met hers, stripping away the title of king, leaving only the man. "Who are you, Clara Hastings?" "I told you," Clara replied, her voice trembling slightly under the intensity of his gaze. "I'm just an Omega. My parents were low-ranking wolves who died in a border skirmish when I was young. I've spent my whole life trying to stay invisible so I wouldn't be a target." She looked down, suddenly acutely aware of her frayed cuffs. "I don't belong in this world. In your world, the moon goddess does not make mistakes," Dominic stated, his voice a low, rumbling absolute. "My wolf went dormant the day Victoria was murdered. He gave up. I have lived as half a man, running an empire on nothing but cold logic and vengeance. But the second you released your scent, my wolf woke up." "He didn't just wake up, Clara. He demanded you." Clara's breath hitched. She knew the legends. When an alpha lost a mate, their inner wolf often went mad or died of a broken heart. Finding a second chance mate was rarer than a blue moon. It was a miracle. But an alpha king and an Omega? It defied every political and biological law of their society. "Serena won't just let this go," Clara warned, thinking of the vicious Bloodwood alpha female. "She's been waiting to be your queen. Her pack is massive. The Council of Elders will say I'm too weak to stand beside you, that my bloodline is inferior." Dominic reached across the space, his large hand gently cupping her jaw, forcing her to look at him. His thumb stroked her pulse point, sending a rush of liquid heat straight to her core. "Let me be perfectly clear, Clara," Dominic murmured, his voice laced with a dangerous, thrilling promise. "I do not care about the Council. I do not care about Serena Whitmore or the Bloodwood Pack. If they dare to question your place at my side, I will burn their territories to the ground and build you a castle on the ashes." Clara stared at him, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. No one had ever fought for her. No one had ever even noticed her. And now, the most powerful predator in the hemisphere was promising her the world. "You are my mate," Dominic continued, his thumb tracing the line of her bottom lip. "You are the mother to my cub. From this moment on, you will never be invisible again, and you will never have to be afraid." Before Clara could process the sheer weight of his vow, the SUV began to slow down. "We're approaching the perimeter, sire," the driver announced through the intercom. Clara looked out the window. The storm had broken, revealing a massive, sprawling estate built directly into the cliffs overlooking the churning, moonlit waters of the Puget Sound. It wasn't just a pack house. It was a compound. High-tech security cameras tracked their movement, and heavily armed perimeter guards, wolves in their human forms carrying military-grade rifles, patrolled the massive iron gates. This was Obsidian Ridge, the seat of the king's power. As the gates swung open, Dominic leaned back in his seat, his eyes never leaving Clara's. "Welcome home, little wolf," he said softly. But as the SUV rolled into the courtyard, Clara noticed a sleek, silver Aston Martin parked near the front steps, its engine still running. Dominic's eyes narrowed instantly, the warm, possessive mate vanishing as the icy king returned. "Jasper," Dominic barked into his comms unit. "Why is Alexander's car in my driveway?" A pause of static, then Jasper's tense voice replied. "He arrived 10 minutes ago, sire. He bypassed the lower checkpoints. He says it's an emergency regarding the Northern Covens." Dominic swore softly, a vicious, archaic curse. He looked at Clara, his expression tightening with regret. "I need you to take Leo inside. Jasper will show you to my private wing. No one, and I mean absolutely no one, is allowed on that floor without my explicit permission." "Who is Alexander?" Clara asked, a cold prickle of unease washing over her. "My brother," Dominic replied, his voice devoid of any familial warmth, "and a man who would love nothing more than to find a weakness to use against me. Do not let him see you." The private wing of the Obsidian Ridge compound was a fortress within a fortress. Jasper, moving with the lethal, silent grace of a seasoned Black Ops operative, escorted Clara and the sleeping Leo up a private glass elevator. The biometric scanners glowed a faint green as Jasper pressed his thumb to the panel, bypassing the heavy titanium-reinforced doors. Inside, the penthouse was a sprawling testament to Dominic's staggering wealth and profound isolation. Floor-to-ceiling bulletproof windows offered a dizzying, panoramic view of the churning Pacific Ocean, but the interior felt like a museum. Cold, immaculate, and entirely devoid of warmth. The furniture was sleek, imported Italian leather. The kitchen was outfitted with industrial Gaggenau appliances that looked as though they had never been used to cook a family meal. "The king's suite is at the end of the hall. The cub's room is adjacent," Jasper instructed, his voice low but completely respectful. It was a jarring shift. Hours ago, Clara was an invisible servant. Now, the beta of the most feared pack in the country was bowing his head to her. "I will be stationed outside the elevator. No one gets on this floor. You are perfectly safe, Luna." Luna. The title sent a shiver down Clara's spine. She nodded, carefully carrying Leo into his bedroom. It was a massive space, painted in muted grays, filled with untouched educational toys, and a bed draped in heavy fret linens. Clara gently laid him down, pulling the duvet to his chin. She sat on the edge of the mattress for a long time, stroking his dark hair, releasing a steady, low-frequency hum of omega energy to keep the nightmares at bay. When she finally stepped out of the room, leaving the door slightly ajar, the penthouse was utterly silent. She walked into the main living area, wrapping her arms around her shivering shoulders. She was still in her cheap serving dress, standing in a room where even the Baccarat crystal decanters on the bar cost more than she made in 5 years. "So, this is the miracle worker." Clara spun around, her heart leaping into her throat. Standing by the massive marble fireplace was a man who looked strikingly like Dominic, but lacking the king's raw, overwhelming mass. He was leaner, dressed impeccably in a tailored navy Brioni suit, a vintage Rolex Daytona gleaming on his wrist. His eyes were the same gray, but they were flat, calculating, cold. "Alexander." "How did you get in here?" Clara demanded, backing up a step. "Jasper is at the door." Jasper is a loyal dog, but he is fundamentally limited by technology. Alexander smirked, holding up a small, sleek black keycard. "Royal Bloodline Override. I built the security framework for this compound. Little Omega. I know every back door." He poured himself a glass of amber liquid from the decanter, taking a slow sip. "I must admit, when I received the encrypted message from Serena that my brother had lost his mind over a Silver Creek servant, I thought it was an exaggeration. But here you are." Clara forced her inner wolf to stay calm. She could smell him now. Beneath the expensive cologne, there was a scent of bitter ozone and decay. It was the scent of a liar. "Dominic is downstairs. If he finds you here, he's currently dealing with a manufactured crisis I authorized an hour ago." Alexander interrupted smoothly, stepping closer. "A rogue incursion on the eastern border. It will keep him occupied for exactly 12 minutes. More than enough time for us to have a chat." Alexander circled her like a shark. "You see, Clara, my brother is a brute. A very effective brute, but a brute nonetheless. When Victoria died, he went feral. He built this massive logistics empire, yes, but politically, he isolated us. He became a tyrant. I have spent 3 years meticulously rebuilding our alliances. The crown jewel of that effort was the Bloodwood Treaty. Serena Whitmore was supposed to be his queen. Their union would have merged the 2 largest corporate and territorial empires on the West Coast. He doesn't want her, Clara said, lifting her chin, and she hates his son. Leo is a defective heir, Alexander snapped, dropping the sophisticated facade for a fraction of a second. He is weak. He is a liability. Serena understood that sacrifices must be made for the greater good of the pack. She was prepared to send the boy away to a specialized facility in Switzerland. Clara's blood ran completely cold. The protective instincts that had surfaced in the ballroom roared back to life, flooding her veins with adrenaline. You were going to get rid of him. I am securing the future of Obsidian Ridge, Alexander corrected coldly. He stopped a few feet from her, his gray eyes narrowing into slits. Victoria was weak too. She was a pacifist. She wanted to open our borders to the southern refugees. She was compromising our security. Clara stopped breathing. The way he said it, the complete lack of grief, the rogue ambush. It wasn't rogues, Clara whispered, the horrific realization dawning on her. 3 years ago. It wasn't rogues who killed his mate. It was you and Bloodwood. Alexander offered a slow, chilling smile. Rogues are so incredibly easy to hire, Clara, and even easier to silence once the job is done. Serena provided the silver-laced weaponry. I provided the coordinates of Victoria's convoy. It was a perfect plan. Dominic was supposed to grieve, realize his vulnerability, and take Serena as his new mate to solidify his power. He took another step toward her, his aura flaring, trying to press her into submission. But he didn't. He went insane and slaughtered half the continent. And now, just when I finally maneuvered him back to the altar with Serena, you show up, a filthy, broken Omega who smells like lavender and mommy issues, ruining years of my work. Clara didn't cower. The crushing weight of his alpha aura washed over her, but it felt hollow compared to Dominic's. She didn't drop to her knees. She stood her ground, her fists clenching at her sides. I will tell him, Clara said, her voice completely steady. No, you won't, Alexander sneered, pulling a slender, silver-forged blade from the inside pocket of his suit jacket. Because you are going to leave. I have a Sikorsky helicopter waiting on the roof. You will get on it. You will disappear to a human city in Europe, fully funded, and you will reject the mate bond. If you do not, I will ensure that the next time rogues breach our perimeter, they don't just target the queen. They will target the cub. Clara looked at the silver blade, then at the hallway leading to Leo's room. A terrifying, ancient power began to uncoil in the deepest, darkest part of her soul. Society taught that Omegas were weak. Society taught that they were submissive peacemakers. But society had forgotten the biological truth of why Omegas existed in the first place. They weren't just healers. They were the absolute, terrifying heart of the pack, and a mother wolf defending her cub was the most dangerous creature on Earth. You made one mistake, Alexander, Clara whispered, her eyes flashing a brilliant, luminescent violet, a color unseen in the werewolf world for centuries. Alexander frowned, brandishing the knife. And what is that? You forgot that I am already in my territory. Before Alexander could react, the heavy titanium elevator doors behind him didn't just open. They were violently ripped off their tracks, the metal screeching in agonizing protest. Dominic stood in the ruined doorway. He wasn't human anymore. He was massive, shifted halfway into his lichen form. His suit was in shreds, thick black fur erupting along his arms and neck. His eyes were twin infernos of glowing gold, and his fangs were fully descended, dripping with saliva. He had caught the scent of the silver blade. He had caught the scent of Clara's distress. Brother, Alexander choked out, his arrogance vanishing in an instant, dropping the knife as if it burned him. Dominic, wait, she attacked. Dominic moved faster than the human eye could track. The sound of Dominic's hand wrapping around his brother's throat was not a simple thud. It was the sickening, wet crunch of cartilage giving way under insurmountable pressure. The Alpha King did not just grab Alexander, he hoisted him off the imported hardwood floor single-handedly, slamming his spine against the floor-to-ceiling reinforced glass window. The impact was so violently kinetic that the bulletproof glass instantly spiderwebbed, emitting a high-pitched shriek that vibrated through the soles of Clara's cheap shoes. Dominic was no longer fully human. The immaculate king who had carried her up the elevator was gone, replaced by a terrifying, primordial beast caught halfway between man and lichen. His custom dress shirt hung in useless, shredded ribbons around a torso that had expanded with thick, corded muscle and coarse black fur. His jaw had elongated slightly, his fangs fully descended and dripping with a hot, venomous saliva that burned tiny holes into the collar of Alexander's navy brioni suit. But it was his eyes that stole the breath from Clara's lungs. They were twin infernos of absolute, soulless gold. He was entirely consumed by the bloodlust of his inner wolf. He had caught the acrid, burning scent of the silver blade. He had caught the scent of Clara's adrenaline and terror. "You brought silver into my home." Dominic's voice wasn't a voice at all. It was a demonic, overlapping growl that seemed to emanate from the shadows of the room rather than his throat. "You threatened my mate." "Dominic," Alexander gasped. His feet kicked uselessly in the air, his polished leather shoes scraping against the unbroken pane of glass beneath him. His face was turning a horrifying, mottled shade of plum as he clawed helplessly at the massive, furred arm holding him suspended. "She's a spy. Silver Creek, Serena is outside. The Bloodwood Army. They will breach." "Let them," Dominic snarled. His claws, thick and dark as obsidian, pierced the fabric of Alexander's suit, sinking deep into the flesh of his brother's shoulder. Blood began to well, hot and dark, spilling over Dominic's knuckles. The metallic tang of it hit the air, sending the Alpha King further into a feral frenzy. He pulled his free arm back, his claws extending fully, preparing to sever Alexander's head from his shoulders in one brutal swipe. "Dominic, wait!" Clara shouted. Dominic froze. The massive muscles in his back locked up, his head snapping toward her with terrifying speed. His golden eyes were wild, unseeing, completely submerged in the violent instincts that had allowed him to build a terrifying empire. For a fraction of a second, Clara saw the monster the entire continent feared. He was seconds away from an execution that would paint his son's walls with blood. But Clara did not flinch. The ingrained Omega instinct to drop to the floor and bare her neck was entirely burned away by the searing heat of the mate bond. She stepped over the discarded silver knife, her chin lifted, and walked straight into the kill zone of the most lethal predator on the western seaboard. She reached out, placing her small, pale hands flat against his heavily muscled, fiercely hot chest. She didn't try to push him away. That would have been like trying to move a mountain. Instead, she anchored him. She closed her eyes and pushed her aura outward. It was a pure, concentrated dose of Omega energy, the kind of ancient, biological sovereignty that historically allowed Luna Queens to walk through raging battlefields untouched. It smelled of ozone, warm rain, and the fierce, unyielding promise of home. "Do not kill him here," Clara said. Her voice did not shake. It rang with a quiet, undeniable authority that echoed in the cavernous penthouse. "Not in the dark. Not in the shadows where your son is sleeping. He committed treason against your crown, against Victoria, and against your cub. If he dies here, he dies a martyr to his own lies. He faces the pack, Dominic. You are a king, not a butcher." Dominic's massive chest heaved beneath her palms. The gold in his eyes flickered violently, warring with the slate gray of his human consciousness. A low, agonizing whine tore from his throat as his beast fought the logic of her words. But the incredible, grounding warmth pouring from her hands into his violently fractured soul was too powerful to resist. The monstrous tension bleeding from his muscles was palpable. He let out a ragged, shuddering breath, his fangs retracting slightly. With a look of sheer disgust, Dominic opened his hand and hurled Alexander to the floor like a piece of discarded garbage. Alexander hit the hardwood with a heavy thud, gasping hungrily for air, clutching his bleeding throat as he scrambled backward like a cornered rat. "Jasper!" Dominic roared, the command shaking the remaining intact glass in the room. The beta materialized instantly from the ruined elevator shaft, flanked by 4 of the king's most elite, heavily scarred guards. They swept into the room, their weapons drawn, their eyes locked onto the bleeding traitor on the floor. "Sire, drag this piece of filth to the courtyard," Dominic commanded, his eyes finally leaving Alexander to look down at Clara. The monstrous lichen features continued to recede, leaving only the devastatingly intense, fiercely protective man behind. "And sound the war horns. If Serena Whitmore and the Bloodwood Pack are at my gates, we will welcome them." 15 minutes later, the atmosphere at Obsidian Ridge had transformed from a tense sanctuary into a fortress prepared for absolute war. The deep, guttural blast of the compound's war horns had echoed off the cliffs of the Puget Sound, summoning every able-bodied warrior from the barracks. The massive, heavily reinforced steel gates of the compound were illuminated by the harsh, blinding glare of halogen floodlights. Outside, the fog was rolling in thick from the ocean, swirling around the ankles of over 100 heavily armed Bloodwood warriors. They stood in perfect, disciplined formation, their eyes glowing faintly in the mist. At their head stood Serena Whitmore. She was draped in a dark leather trench coat, a silver-laced whip coiled at her hip. She looked triumphant, her sharp features twisted into a smug smile, entirely expecting the gates to open and reveal Alexander victorious, holding the broken crown of a mad king. Instead, the heavy steel mechanisms ground open to reveal a living nightmare. Dominic strode out into the freezing fog. He was fully in his human form, wearing a fresh, pitch-black tactical shirt that clung to his broad chest, but he radiated an aura so intensely oppressive that the front line of the Bloodwood army instinctively took a half-step backward. Several younger wolves instantly dropped to one knee, clutching their chests as the psychic pressure of the Alpha King crushed the air from their lungs. Jasper and the elite guard followed closely behind, dragging a battered, bleeding Alexander by the collar of his ruined suit. With a brutal heave, Jasper threw the king's brother roughly into the sharp gravel, directly at Serena's custom leather boots. Serena's triumphant smirk vanished instantly, the blood draining from her face as she looked down at her co-conspirator. But it was the woman walking seamlessly beside the king that caused a ripple of shocked murmurs to tear through the Bloodwood ranks. Clara walked beside Dominic, her hands securely and unapologetically enveloped in his massive grip. She was still wearing the simple, frayed black serving dress from Silver Creek, but she looked like a deity descending from the mountain. The invisible, hunched Omega was gone. Her spine was perfectly straight, her head held high, and her eyes practically glowed with a brilliant, luminescent violet in the harsh floodlights. Alexander Sterling has confessed. Dominic's voice boomed across the courtyard, a weaponized baritone that easily cut through the howling wind off the sound. It wasn't just a shout. It was an alpha broadcast, forcing every wolf within a 5-mile radius to hear his words in their very bones. He has confessed to the assassination of Queen Victoria, orchestrated in secret collusion with the Bloodwood Pack. He has confessed to treason against the crown, and tonight, he attempted to assassinate my true mate. Chaos erupted in the Bloodwood ranks. Warriors exchanged panicked, furious glances. Serena panicked. Her entire political life, her carefully constructed web of lies, was collapsing in real time. She stepped back, her hand flying to the whip at her side. "It's a lie," she shrieked, her voice shrill and desperate. "Look at him. The king is insane. He's been bewitched by some low-born, filthy Omega. She's poisoning his mind. Bloodwood, stand your ground." "Silence," Dominic roared, the sheer force of the command cracking the pavement beneath his boots. But Serena, realizing that surrender meant execution, chose to burn the world down with her. She bared her fangs, her eyes flashing a desperate, violent red. "Take them," she screamed to her warriors, drawing her weapon. "They are outnumbered. The king is weak, bound to a useless servant. Rip her apart and take the compound." A tense, agonizing second stretched. Then, driven by blind loyalty to their alpha female, the Bloodwood wolves surged forward, a tidal wave of muscle, claws, and silver weaponry. Dominic's guards instantly shifted, roaring as they raised their rifles and braced for the bloody impact. But Clara did not let the war begin. She let go of Dominic's hand and stepped directly in front of him. She closed her eyes, tapped into the profound, ancient bond tethering her to the Alpha King, and reached deep into the well of her soul. She unleashed her aura. It wasn't a concussive, violent blast of dominance like an alpha's. It was a shockwave of absolute, blinding devotion and biological supremacy. The Omega aura rolled over the courtyard like a massive, silent tidal wave. It smelled of terrifyingly fierce maternal protection, crushing the scent of rain and blood. When the wave hit the Obsidian Ridge guards, the effect was instantaneous. Their eyes flared a brilliant, unified gold. The Omega pheromones stripped away their fear, their pain, and their hesitation, replacing it with a berserker rage entirely focused on protecting their Luna. They didn't just feel strong. Their muscles swelled, their senses heightened to supernatural degrees. They felt utterly invincible. But the aura hit the charging Bloodwood attackers entirely differently. To them, it was a sudden, impenetrable wall of biological authority. It hijacked their central nervous systems, screaming at their DNA that they were attacking the very heart of the wolf species. It was a physical impossibility to harm a true Omega at the height of her power. Half the Bloodwood army collapsed mid-stride. Their momentum abruptly died as their knees hit the sharp gravel. Weapons clattered uselessly to the ground. Ferocious, battle-hardened warriors suddenly found themselves whining in profound, uncontrollable submission. Their foreheads pressed to the wet earth, entirely paralyzed by the sheer grace and power radiating from the small woman in the black dress. Serena watched in absolute, paralyzing horror as her formidable army dissolved into a field of subservient, kneeling wolves in a matter of seconds. Her whip slipped from her trembling fingers. Dominic looked at Clara, his chest tight with an emotion so massive and overwhelming it threatened to break his ribs. He had spent his entire life believing that true power was forged in blood, terror, and isolation. He had been completely wrong. True, unbreakable power was forged right here, in the soul of the woman standing fearlessly before an army. "Jasper," Dominic ordered quietly, the ice returning to his voice as he looked at Serena. "Secure the traitors. Prepare them for the Elders' Tribunal at dawn." Jasper and the enhanced guards moved with terrifying, blur-like efficiency. Serena didn't even have the breath to scream before she was apprehended, her arms violently restrained behind her back, her fate permanently sealed. Alexander, kneeling in the gravel and weeping in terror, was dragged away toward the holding cells carved deep beneath the cliffs, destined never to see the sun again. The sprawling courtyard fell utterly silent, save for the rhythmic, crashing waves of the Pacific Ocean far below. The remaining Bloodwood wolves remained pressed to the earth, entirely submitting to the new regime, waiting for the king's judgment. But Dominic wasn't looking at them. He turned to Clara. He didn't care about the hundreds of eyes watching them, or the blood drying on his knuckles. He dropped to one knee on the rough, unforgiving gravel, taking both of her small hands in his massive ones. He pressed his lips to her knuckles, his icy eyes completely melted, burning with an eternal, unwavering devotion that he would carry to his grave. "My Luna," Dominic vowed, his voice thick with an emotion that sounded suspiciously like relief. "My queen, my life." Clara looked down at the fearsome, legendary Alpha King kneeling in the dirt at her feet. She thought of the little boy sleeping peacefully in the glass tower above, finally safe from the monsters that had haunted his nightmares. She thought of the years she had spent trying to make herself small, trying to be invisible. She squeezed Dominic's hands tightly, a radiant, fearless smile breaking across her face, illuminating the dark night. "Get up, Dominic," Clara whispered softly, the violet in her eyes sparkling with a new, dangerous thrill. "We have a pact to run." The saga of Clara Hastings and the Alpha King fundamentally dismantled the archaic structures of the werewolf world. What began in the shadowed, terrifying silence of a banquet hall, a simple act of an Omega shielding a shattered child, ignited a revolution. Clara's ascension proved that true strength is not measured solely by fangs, physical dominance, or the capacity for violence, but by the profound courage to heal, to anchor, and to love fiercely. By stepping out of her forced invisibility, she didn't just save a terrified 4-year-old boy. She resurrected a king from the ashes of his own grief and thwarted a deeply rooted political betrayal. Her reign alongside Dominic ushered in an era where Omegas were no longer discarded relics, but revered as the absolute, unbreakable core of the pack. In the end, the most dangerous weapon in the Obsidian Ridge arsenal wasn't silver or claws, it was her unwavering smile.